So our next speaker is, I don't know his first name. The first name?
Nick.
Nick Papior is going to speak about current induced forces and removing periodicity in DFT plus
It's working, right? Yeah.
non-equilibrium Green's function calculations.
Good. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me, and I'm very happy to come here and give this talk. And in this community, I'm not afraid to put equations on the first slide, so I hope it's not too early for that. All of the work that we've been doing here is done using the Transiester methodology, the DFT+NEGF, and using our own set of developed tools for post-processing and tight binding transport calculations. So the outline today will be about current-induced forces in graphene nanoconstrictions, and then in the second part I'll move into removing periodicities in DFT+NEGF calculations, how you can efficiently do that. And the work I will present has mainly been done by in the first part, the work has been done by Susanne. She's here in the audience as well. And the second part I've done probably mainly with Gaetano and our supervisor, Mads Brandby. So first, a bit of motivation for the graphene current-induced forces. These are all experiments with creation of graphene nanogaps using the so-called electroburning method. And in principle, you start with a graphene sample, and you can post-process it with some holes in it. And then you apply an increasing bias, and the current will increase. And until it starts to decline, when it starts to decline, you'll have some breaking of bonds in the structure. And you do this repeatedly, and the breakdown voltage decreases until you are down to single bonds, or you can break also those bonds. So essentially, you end up with a fully separated nanogap, and once you have that, you know it's very short because you've defined it by removing single bonds, and then it becomes possible to overlay certain molecules or combinations of molecules. And that way you could do graphene contacts with molecules on top of that. Another way to do the same kind of experiments would be to do mechanically controlled break junctions. That has also been done. There you can also reattach the graphene systems again by just sliding them back, pass a current, and then the system will sort of heal itself. That's the same case here. You can also heal itself by other methods. Here you actually see this rehealing, which also creates a on-off state. You start with the off state and you apply a bias, and then by atom migration and current-induced forces, you will actually recover a path where you have a current flowing. So you can create a atomically thin contact by applying a large bias. And this has been repeated a couple of times using different methods, but more or less the same thing happens. You have an off state where you have the nanogap, you apply a big bias, and you recreate the junction, which you don't really know how it looks like, but you at least know to some degree that it's probably a single electron pathway, or maybe a few, depending on the width or the magnitude of the current that flows. And typically what you see is that if you have a very wide molecular junction here that's created by, say, 2 lines of carbon chains, what you'll have is interference effects, so you actually get a much reduced current flowing compared to if you only have a single linear chain of carbon. So what we are trying to do is we try to understand what is the role of currents doing to the forces, and how can you describe the switching or atomic motion by passing a current. Apply a high bias, you move atoms. That's sort of the thing. And in particular, in the graphene case, you have very high breakthrough current densities, 10 to the 9 amps per square centimeter. So you can really pass high currents. So in our systems, we will look at the adiabatic current-induced forces using the standard methodology. And we calculate here the forces using the Hellman-Feynman theorem, and you calculate the density matrix here using this expression in the NEGF scheme. So these are electrons or density arriving from the left lead here, and this is densities arriving from the right lead. Okay. The influence of the current on the bonds, that's what we are really interested in. And here there's been some previous work also done by Brandby in 2003, where you have gold electrodes and then a small gold junction, gold linear chain. And what they find is that the bond forces are very much correlated with the overlap population of the bonds. So the bond forces are either attracting or repulsive, and that corresponds very well with the overlap population. So what is this? The overlap population, that has been analyzed for quite some time in the non-orthogonal basis sets, already in 1988 by Hoffman, this crystal orbital overlap population, which is basically just this term here. And this is just the same thing, but this is a two-level model. But you'll find that if this is positive, you'll have a bonding state. If it's negative, you'll have an antibonding state. And you'll always get this picture of a bonding, and on top of it, you have the antibonding state. So essentially, if you can map a density or the overlap population onto these things, you can figure out whether you're in a bonding state or an antibonding state. In the linear response regime, you can expand the density or the induced density due to the current. You can do that by having the zero bias density coming from one of the leads and the other lead, and then expand it using Fermi functions, and this will derive into the so-called wind forces. And the wind forces is exactly, it's this equation, and you populate either antibonding states or bonding states, and you also depopulate it on the right lead, depending on the chemical potentials. So our system of interest is a system we've been exploring for years now. We really know what's happening in this system. We've done also inelastic scattering in these systems. And the nice thing about this system is that it's rather simple, it's symmetric. It has the graphene electrodes, which has a very funny effect that when you gate it, you can pin the electrostatic potential or the potential drop to one of the electrodes, depending on the polarity of the doping and of the bias. So this will be a four-symmetric matrix. So if you reverse the gating for the same bias, you'll reverse the drop, or if you reverse the bias, you'll also reverse the drop. So this is a funny way. If you can control the potential drop, you can actually also control where if you have atoms sitting right at the potential drop, maybe they experience a much higher force than they would see in the other region where you don't have the potential drop. So we are rather interested in trying to make use of this to control the flow of atoms. So Susanne did all these calculations, and it's slightly a smaller system, but it's more or less the same. It has all the same features as the bigger system. So here we plot the potential drop at a 1 volt bias. We plot the induced density, the current induced density. We plot the bond currents, also integrated over the Fermi functions, and we also plot the forces. So what you see here is that the potential drop lies rather to the right, and that corresponds very well with dipoles that actually induce this potential drop. The bond currents, they sort of go along the edges, that's also well known, and the forces, they look like this. So a first proposition would be you have a high current. So if you have a high current, shouldn't you also have a high force? You have lots of things that go through, so they should push on the atoms in some way. And as it turns out, we couldn't really find any correlation with that. We have the bond currents here, we have the forces here. That's, in this case, the forces are projected onto bonds. So the blue one here is the bond between these two atoms, and the blue color means that it's repulsive, and the red one means that they are attracting. And if you plot the bond forces versus the bond currents, you don't find any correlation at all. I should remark that some do find correlations. We haven't been able to find it, so I don't know if it's, that's somewhat unclear. We haven't been able to find it. Maybe in some systems it may occur, but we haven't been able, at least not in this system. So, on the other hand, if we look at the overlap population, which is what I showed you before. In this case, it's not the energy resolved, it's the total non-equilibrium overlap population. You'll find a perfectly linear agreement with the bond forces and the overlap population. This is a little bit surprising that it works so well. We didn't expect it to be that linear, but that's good. So we argue that we can actually just calculate the overlap population in some way, and that's a good proxy for the actual force that you'll see in a final system. It's working for this system here, the graphene nanoconstriction, and it also works for a 3D model of linear gold change. So that's rather good. You can also expand this into an energy resolved orbital overlap population, and in that way you can figure out whether you are really doing a bonding, anti-bonding states, or a combination of that. And that's what we try to do here. So we use the spectral functions from each of the leads to do an energy resolved overlap population. And then we plot it in the bias range because that's where you have the non-equilibrium density arising from. So there's no point in doing anything else. And here you focus in on this region, you have M&M, and you find that the population of the bonding states, it's mainly taking part in the left lead because that has the high potential. So you know that's where you populate states from. On the right side, you are depleting states. So here you are populating bonding states, and here you are also depleting the bonding states, but the net result is a bonding condition. Similarly, for the NK bonds here, you get a antibonding state and also an antibonding state there, but it's much bigger, and therefore you get the correlation. So these plots can be used to really analyze the detailed molecular orbitals, well, not molecular orbitals, but molecular bonds, and try to figure out at high bias if you have a combination of these states, and in particular, if you have many more molecular orbitals in the bias window, this could be of relevance to really figure out what's happening in those ranges. Another thing that's very interesting is what happens, well, what is clear is also that the potential drop is where you have the maximum forces. That's not too surprising, but what happens, another question is what happens far from the potential drop? This you can think of as a system where you have current flowing, but you don't have a potential drop. So it's sort of a bulk material with a current flowing. And even in this very long system, you still find this linear correlation, so we know that the overlap population still works very well for these systems. So we did the full non-equilibrium calculation. We extracted the forces here at a very far distance from the potential drop, so we know that this is sort of a bulk-like position. And then we implemented a new thing where you populate your states according to the velocity of the block bands. So if you do that, you can apply a fictitious bias in your bulk material where you have a current flowing. And we did that by, if you have a positive velocity, you shift it up, or you populate more. If you have a negative velocity, you depopulate some of those. And this is just a fictitious applied bias. But in the end, what you find is that the agreement between this bulk force, bulk current force, agrees very well with the full non-equilibrium Green function calculations. So we think we also have a better understanding of what is happening in the far field currents, what it does to structures. In this case, you see both contraction and you see mainly contraction, but also a little bit of repulsion here. So for other systems, you may find that it contracts due to high currents, and using this simple calculation, you can probably find out whether it induces stress in systems if you have a very high current running. Okay, so the conclusions on the current induced forces. What is the time? 12 minutes. Oh, that's good. Okay. Yeah. So the conclusions on the current-induced forces is we think we understand that the bond population is a very good proxy for forces. So if you can calculate the bond overlap population in some other way, and maybe you don't need to do the full DFT+NEGF thing. Non-equilibrium filling depletion of bonding anti-bonding states. You can do the energy resolved analysis and figure out whether you are dealing with anti-bonding states, how they disperse in the bias window. We also found that the potential drop plays a major role for the change in bond populations, and therefore also the forces, or you could also reverse that argument. And that's not so surprising, but it's very important to always consider where the potential drop plays. And this goes back to where we could position the potential drop in our graphene nanoconstriction. If you can control the potential drop, you can also control where the forces are highest. And possibly also, if you add atoms, maybe they will be burst through a position of high bias, and if you can swap the position of that in a graphene nanoconstriction, you may have some external control of atom migration on top of surfaces. Lastly, we also understood the bulk forces due to currents by doing this small variation due to the block velocities, and they correspond very well to the calculations as well. Yes. So now to something different. So this was a project that it has two sides of the story actually. So this thing that I will go through today is done by mainly Gaetano and Susanne, and I also did some of this. So what the question is, what happens, for instance, in STM systems with single defects? In particularly in 2D systems, because you have surfaces or in other surfaces. The other question is, what happens in the far field currents? And they are very much correlated, these two questions. And this work we have done with all these collaborators. So Isaac and Gaetano did all these calculations, and the co-workers here, Thomas, Aran, and Bernie, they are actually all here in the audience. We did calculations on NPGs, large-scale tight binding models, 400,000 atoms, and you can really control the currents in the far field by doing manipulations with the NPGs. So the NPGs is a bottom-up synthesis of these multifunctional nanoporous graphene, and they can really produce very big samples with high quality, and this we have tried to investigate a bit. But today I will focus mainly on this single question on single defects. So the problem that we face, this has been mentioned during the past few days, is the periodic boundary condition. That turns out to be a major issue. In DFT calculations, you typically have periodic boundary conditions all over. So what you're actually simulating is a defect next to it. So what you really need to be careful about is the distance between the defects. You need them to be electrostatically decoupled in order to really get a good feel or a good calculation or a good result for that system. The NEGF approach, that tries to solve that a little bit. So what it does is you create open boundaries on two sides, and that leaves you with only mirror defects on one transverse direction. So that's a little bit better. That's a little bit better. But even here you have problems, because you have to have a very long distance, otherwise you can see interference effects. That may be very important for transport calculations, and that's very dependent on the system as well, but you really need to converge the width of your system in order to not have interference effects for currents. Now our question is, why don't we put self-energies all around it? If you have self-energies all around it, you fully decouple the electronic structure from the periodic images. And it's exactly the same argument. There's no difference between the other NEGF methods. It's a self-energy. It can describe whatever. In this case, it describes a fully infinite system in all directions. It can be 3D, it can be 2D. 1D is always already solved, so we don't care about that one. The thing is that the same premise for the 2 electrode thing happens for the surrounding self-energy thing. What is important is that the coupling between the self-energies and into your defect region needs to be constant in the pristine system as for the defected system. So you still need to electrostatically decouple to the edges, but once you have that, you can use that self-energy in a fully pristine way. The calculation of the self-energy boils down to this integral of the Green's function in k-space, so you really need to do this integral, which is also the problem. The problem is that the Green's function in the k-space has poles near to the eigenstates, so you see these very sharp peaks, and you need to integrate that. So in this case, you would probably need like 400 k-bonds to really get a good description of this thing. This is a simple tight binding model. It only has 2 states. It's the graphene sample, and it's tight binding. So it's very efficient. You can do that very easily. The problem is that you really want to calculate the self-energy or the Green's function for a big system, because you need the surrounding self-energy. So you need the Green's function for a very big system to decouple it from itself. But the Green function calculation scales in cubically, and the size of the Green function depends on this surrounding part. So if you have a very big defect, you need a very big Green's function. If you have a small defect, you don't need as much. That's not a problem. But so far, that has been the limiting factor, that this one, the dimensionality of this one, really scales cubically, and inverting that matrix with, say, 300 k-points, forget about it. You will not going to do that. You cannot do these real space Green's functions for full matrices. It needs to be no more than a few hundred orbitals, the matrix dimensions. Otherwise, you can spend ages on calculating those. So we found a method, and it's actually very easy. It relies on 3 well-established methods in the community, and we just put them together. And the key point is that we always work with the minimal unit cell. So you only do Green's function calculations on the minimal unit cell, and then you expand that to a big thing. It works by 3 parts. You take the surface self-energy along one direction. That removes one of the k integrals, because you have this perfectly pristine 1D self-energy along one direction. So now you only need to integrate 1k direction. In 3D, you still need to integrate 2, but in 2D, you only need to integrate 1 more k direction. Then you do a block tri-diagonal inversion, and in the bulk case, you'll find certain symmetries in this. You'll find that this is a triplets matrix, so you have all the diagonal elements are the same, all the off-diagonal elements corresponding to indices, they turn out to be the same as well. And then finally, once you have the Green's function in a small unit cell, you can do a block expansion of the Green's function to a bigger cell. So that solves the last problem of inverting the matrix in a big unit cell. You only need to calculate it for the smallest possible unit cell. So we put this together, and here's a small calculation this is also graphene. The full matrix for all these points is 2048. So this is the final Green's function size in dimensions. If you do the full thing, it takes around more than 200 seconds to calculate this. It's one energy point, and doesn't matter how many k points, because all the k points correspond to the same sampling. So it takes more than 200 seconds for this one, but you have a sweet spot down here, the lower you get, the better. The reason is that here you have lots of overhead, and you don't have a threaded blast for these small matrices, so that's a technical detail. The thing is, the smaller you can do, the better. That's the important thing. The good thing is that here you are down to like 3-5 seconds, so you are going down 2 orders of magnitude, and if you want to go even larger, 4,000, you go 1 order of magnitude even further down. So the bigger this one is, the faster this one will be compared to the full thing. So a bit of, so this concludes you can really do real space green functions at relatively low costs. So what we we did a few case studies. In this case, we have a nitrogen defect in graphene. This is well studied, both from STM experiments, but also from theory. We have a good grasp of what's happening. And the STM experiments, this is the experiment, and these are the DFT calculations, and they correspond very well. So you would argue, okay, it doesn't really matter what this effect is. Do you really need real space green functions? Probably not. But if you do a DFT study of this with periodic boundary conditions, you'll see that the nitrogen defect is actually having a dispersion in the Brin zone. That's not a single defect. This is a graphene 9x9 system, so it has 162 atoms. So it's a relatively big system, and you still see dispersion. But actually, this system gives you the correct STM image. So it captures the main idea, and that's good. So that is good. What you will find here is that you'll have a two-peak structure in the density of states. One here, and one here if you project onto the nitrogens. So what we did is we did the same calculation. We did it with siesta, fully periodic boundary conditions. We did it with ton siesta that has 2 electrodes, so you still have the mirror along one direction. And then we did it with no periodic boundary conditions with the real space method. And notice in the siesta method you have 3 dips. That's because you don't have an equal size on both directions. So then you see also a split there. If we did this in a skewed system, you would see only 2 peaks in the periodic boundary conditions calculations. If you do the 2 electrode thing, you will only see 2 peaks. So that's the fainted gray one here, and this one, this is sort of, these would be spread out to 1. And when you do the real space thing, you squeeze it down only to 1 very broad peak. And actually, if you do very large-scale type binding models, 400,000 atoms, you will find that this is very much in agreement with these kind of calculations. You can also explicitly calculate this using a defect model analytically. Another thing is the STM tip on graphene. In this case, STM on 2D materials is the de facto standard of investigating stuff. And you really see lots of details, but what you really have is one tip and infinite 2D material. So we want to try and investigate that, and we've done several calculations with that. In this case, we've done both the 2 electrode and the 1 electrode system. And here this is also with an elevated, okay, yes. This is also with the bias, so you can include bias also in the real space calculations. And here you see a clear difference between the 2 methods. So this is the density of states on the atom just below the tip, and this is the transmission function. The transmission doesn't really change that much. It really does change something where you have the chemical potential of the tip. And that's just at this point, at half an eV. So there you clearly see that something is happening. Now, what is causing this effect is that the tips really do interact. If you put an STM tip on graphene, what you will see in real calculations is a 6-fold symmetry of the currents. But if you only do 2 electrodes and a transverse direction, you have the coupling between the tips. That leads to only 2-fold. This will actually, depending on the size, it will give you 4-fold. But the ones that couple to itself, it also depends on the rotation of the thing. But you have this coupling between the tips, which removes that degeneracy mode. So this is an artifact of the interference effect, and you can completely remove that by using a real space self-energy. As a final thing, so it's nice to have surrounding self-energies, but it's also very nice to really study surfaces. That's very important for 3D systems, gold surfaces, any kind of surface where you have bulk material. And so we had to extend our methodology to also be able to do these kind of systems, and that is a little bit more tricky, but it's still doable, not a problem. There, the minimal unit cell is the full ribbon here up to the surface, and then you can also calculate the real space green functions for those kind of systems. So here you have the pristine graphene here and a single graphene nanoribbon attached to this one. Here you don't see too much of a difference. the two nanoribbons, or the defected interference nanoribbons, they don't really see each other. You don't have interference effects that's high. So you don't see too much happening. Well, still you see shifts in energies, but the overall picture is more or less the same. So our implementation allows 2D surrounding self-energies. That's what I did in the STM. A 3D point defect. That's for gold, a point defect in gold, for instance. Cylindrical defects, that would be line defects. You can do that, so you have real space along perpendicular cylindrical coordinates and a k vector along the length of the cylinder. You can do surfaces like this, and you can do 3D surfaces with bulk things for STM stuff as well. Now, I've talked a lot about that this is good, it's more accurate, you get better results, but is it actually also feasible? What you need to remember is you do the Green's function calculations, and you get out the self-energy for the real space. So you remove all the k points where you have the real space self-energy. So the real thing that you reduce in your calculations, especially in the self-consistent calculations, is the k points. You go from, say, 8 by 8 k points to 1 k point, regardless of size. Always 1 k point, because the real space self-energy describes the infinite, truly infinite system. So that is where you really get the speed or the performance of this one. So here I listed the total amount of time we spent on all the calculations in Siesta, the fully periodic thing. The problem is the projected density of state. That takes a lot of time. You need a really dense grid, and diagonalizing a huge matrix that many times is very difficult. For the 2-electrode system in the graphene nitrogen, it gets a lot better. But for the real space thing, it's almost half the time of the 2-terminal thing. The graphene STM, it has the same thing. It is 3 times faster than the 2-terminal thing. And also the ZGNR, it's also faster, even in the surface case, where it's a little bit more complicated. So from this, we think that we found a method. It's faster than usual methods. It's the trivial calculation of the real space Green's function is embarrassingly parallel. You need to do that once, and then you just reuse it in the self-consistency cycle. Yeah, so we believe it's feasible, it's better, and that's probably what we're going to use all the time now. So the conclusion is, for the talk, the current-induced forces, I'll just repeat a little bit, the change in bond population, that's a very good proxy for the actual forces you'll see. You have the non-equilibrium filling depletion of the bonding and anti-bonding states. You can really decipher what's happening in your junction by examining the bias window. The potential drop really plays a major role. And we also understood the bulk forces due to currents by doing the velocity-dependent fillings. For the periodicity, removing the periodicity, we have provided an efficient calculation of the real space self-energies. And this really allows truly single defects in NEGF calculations. And we've also shown that, at least for these systems, the methodology is faster than equivalent precision Brillouin zone sampled DFT calculations. And I think that's more or less. I wish to thank all the speakers. And I'll announce, there was a post on Psych-K yesterday, probably you've seen it. We're going to host another quantum transport school using our tools. It will be held here, so you know the place. So please sign up if you have any interest in this. And thank all the collaborators and also the local collaborators here at the DIPC. Thank you.
I didn't fully follow your talk. It was a very nice talk, but let me ask you. So you, the origin of the force is the change in charge density and the electrostatic kind of force plus the forces between the currents.
The force, yeah. So you both have this electrostatic effect, and you have the change in the bond population. But what turns out is that the bond population change also reflects the potential drop. So you see all the effects in only the the bond or the overlap population.
Right, and also there is a force between two parallel currents, for example. So you take that also into account.
A force between, no, that's not taking answer. This is just a priori, you take the density matrix and calculate the overlap population. We don't do any drag forces on the opposing currents or anything like that.
Because that is negligible.
Well, probably for these systems, definitely, because you have one current path. I suspect the drag force would probably be more important for things that are decoupled rather than coupled systems. I may be wrong.
I see.
That's
and thank you. And also, so in reality, if there is a force, then the atoms will be displaced. So in your case, how large will be the displacement for typical currents?
Yeah, that's we didn't do the displacements because this is initial calculations. We want to do the atom migration, so that's the next step. You can do the simple expansion of the forces. You have the forces, you can see how much that displaces. In this case, it doesn't break the junction, at least. You need higher currents for these calculations, or higher bias, sorry.
I remember long ago, maybe in 17, so there was an activity related to electromigration, and there were classical works by Piles. So there was even this, I remember this electromigration theorem. And I think there was a certain confusion related to the origin of the force, like this momentum transfer from the floor or the dipole. And the theorem was, I think, that everything is accounted by this dipole created force. I don't remember exactly, but can you somehow comment on this? Is it somehow related to what I'm doing?
Yeah, you could say. I mean, what you see is the overlap population also, because it's a change in the overlap population, it also reflects the dipole that are induced. So they are very much correlated. It's just another way to look at it in the terms of the basis set. So you could say it's exactly the same thing as the dipole argument.
Yeah. So related to this, so basically you are computing the Ehrenfest forces, right?
The what?
The Ehrenfest force.
Yes.
There is no correction because at some point the group of Mats Rambüge was doing some corrections to try to include some fluctuations of ions, but this is plain.
This is plain.
So in that case, I guess it is not so surprising that there is a correlation with overlap populations because basically the formula that you obtain for those forces already contain this as a basic ingredient.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Okay. I have another question related to the last part of your talk. You mentioned that it's important to take into account the electrostatics when you do this central defect in the surroundings. So are you doing something special for it, or just you are taking a big chunk of material to take it into account?
Yeah, we don't solve the Poisson equation correctly. We know that's a problem, but it turns out it doesn't create too much of a problem in this case. But these are also very highly connected systems. So maybe for something with much weaker connections and the electrostatic effects are higher, you need a better correction for the
kind of metallic also.
Oh yeah.
So if they will. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the other thing to improve. Really, is the Poisson solution there.
Okay. Very nice. Thank you.
Is it correct then that the force? Sorry. Is it correct then that the force is? I mean, if you take a snapshot charge density, it's like the Hellman-Feynman force, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you have the machinery of the Poisson equation as you do in static DFT calculations to handle that?
Well, we have the Poisson. It's just that we don't have the correct boundary conditions in the transport calculations. Or maybe we have periodic boundary conditions in the electrostatic case for the surrounding self-energies, and also for the other thing. In the two-terminal thing, you get the correct thing because you correct the Poisson equation, but in the other one, we still have the problem of the coupling between the defects electrostatically.
How much is the orbital population affected by your arbitrary choice of non-orthogonal orbitals?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've done it for a few basis sets. We see the same trend. So, yeah, it needs more thorough, careful, but I don't think it will change anything. The problem is we also want to figure out what is the influence if you have a orthogonal basis set. Then you don't have an overlap population. So how can you translate that into a proxy in the good way? So it's along the same lines, you could say.
There are basis independent indicators like ELF, for instance. This is one thing. And the other, I say, worrying thing is the following. I know pretty well that if you take a hydrogen molecule with a fixed basis set and you move the ions, then the Hellman-Feynman theorem is violated.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
yeah.
Okay, I think we have to move to the next speaker. So let's thank Nick again. Jakob.